Automaker Stellantis announced a pause on production at some of its Canadian and Mexican assembly plants, and as a result, some temporary layoffs.
You're about to hear something that could change everything you thought you knew about the US auto industry. Stellantis, the powerhouse behind Jeep, Dodge, and Chrysler, just triggered a massive shakeup, laying off thousands of workers and threatening the livelihoods of entire communities. The reason? A deadly mix of declining sales, skyrocketing costs, and the unstoppable rise of electric vehicles. As the company slashes jobs and rethinks its future, the big question is, can Stellantis survive this? Or is this the beginning of the end for these legendary American brands? The collapse of America's auto heartbeat. Why are the giants failing? When Stellantis made the announcement of mass layoffs in January 2025, it wasn't just another corporate downsizing. It was a seismic shock to the US auto industry, one that echoed across entire communities built around these factories for generations. Toledo and Warren weren't just plants. They were pillars of local economies. Workers weren't just employees. They were part of a culture that had persisted for decades. Jeep, Dodge, and Chrysler were once the embodiment of the American auto industry. Jeep, known for its rugged off-road dominance, Dodge with its muscle cars and high-performance vehicles, Chrysler once a leader in luxury sedans. These brands weren't just cars. They were part of the American fabric. But that was before the auto industry was hit by forces it couldn't ignore: economic pressures, shifting consumer tastes, and technological upheaval. In the years leading up to 2025, Stellantis' flagship vehicles like the Jeep Grand Cherokee and Dodge Durango continued to dominate sales. However, consumer preferences began to change. The market had shifted. As global warming became a pressing issue, rising gas prices, combined with growing environmental awareness, made larger SUVs and trucks less desirable. Consumers wanted more fuel-efficient options. They were turning their attention to electric vehicles, EVs, hybrids, and smaller, more affordable models. In many ways, Stellantis was caught in the crossfire between two worlds. It had legacy production lines, massive SUVs, trucks, and sedans that were no longer appealing to a younger, more eco-conscious generation. At the same time, it had to contend with foreign competitors like Hyundai, Toyota, and Volkswagen, which were rapidly ramping up their EV offerings. These brands were gaining market share by being nimble and more attuned to consumer preferences. Stellantis, however, was bogged down by its reliance on its aging lineup, which was beginning to look out of place in the changing market. The shock was real. Jeep, Dodge, and Chrysler, once pillars of American industry,
Chrysler has always been the weakest of the three major producers in the United States,
were now looking at a very uncertain future. By 2024, Stellantis was facing what industry insiders called a tipping point. Sales for the Jeep Grand Cherokee, once a top contender in the SUV market, had taken a sharp dive. The Durango and Charger were losing traction in a market flooded with more efficient, more affordable competitors. Chrysler, which had once dominated the luxury car market, was now relegated to just two models, an aging minivan and a sedan that no one seemed interested in. The solution, from Stellantis' perspective, seemed clear. There needed to be a major realignment, a re-evaluation of what they produced, how much they produced, and who they produced it for. This wasn't just about cutting costs or adjusting marketing strategies, it was about survival. And unfortunately, the survival of Stellantis meant the sacrifice of many longtime workers.
Never support a layoff. I always want to come to work and make money.
They weren't just scaling back, they were fundamentally shifting their business model to focus on future technology, especially electric vehicles. However, this shift came with its own set of massive challenges, including how to transition from a gas-powered lineup to a hybrid and fully electric model. But the question that lingers is this: could Stellantis make this transition quickly enough to avoid a deeper collapse? The company had bet big on EVs in recent years. They made promises to the market that they would be at the forefront of the electric revolution, but the reality is, electric vehicles, even in an increasingly eco-conscious world, haven't yet fully captured the mass market. Sales are slowing, and the demand is not yet universal. As Stellantis worked hard to align itself with the EV revolution, it faced a fundamental challenge: how to transition without alienating the consumer base that had kept them afloat for decades. This chapter is about more than just vehicles. It's about the tectonic shifts that are rocking an entire industry. But how did we get here? Was it poor planning, or was this inevitable?
Appreciate the fact that they finally heard us and gave us some money to help us sell these cars.
Can Stellantis re-engineer itself in time to save its place in the industry? As the dust settles from these mass layoffs, the implications are just beginning to ripple across the United States. The future of the American auto industry doesn't just depend on what Stellantis does next. It depends on how the entire industry responds to this unprecedented shift. What happens when one of America's largest automakers pulls the trigger on mass layoffs? Is this the beginning of the end for traditional manufacturers, or is it a necessary pivot to ensure survival? And what's next for the thousands of workers now left in limbo? The silent storm. What's really behind Stellantis' layoffs? When Stellantis first announced the massive layoffs in early 2025, it wasn't just a reaction to weak sales or production inefficiencies. It was a reflection of an industry in turmoil. Stellantis, like its competitors, was facing a perfect storm of economic and structural challenges. But while many saw the layoffs as a necessary evil, the deeper questions remained. What was really behind this move? And what did it mean for the future of not just Stellantis, but the US auto industry as a whole? Let's take a closer look at what triggered Stellantis' dramatic decision to cut jobs across two of its key plants. For the Toledo South Assembly plant, the loss of over 100 jobs was the culmination of a series of decisions made over several years. For workers who had built their lives around this plant, the news was devastating. But the reasons behind the cuts weren't just about declining demand. They went deeper. Stellantis has long been a company built on its legacy products, the powerful SUVs, trucks, and sedans that have defined the American road for decades. Jeep, Dodge, and Chrysler have been pillars of American automotive culture, vehicles that symbolize the freedom and ruggedness of the open road. But as the years went on, the market started to change. And so did consumer preferences. With increasing concerns about climate change, rising fuel prices, and the push for cleaner energy, buyers began shifting away from traditional gas-guzzling SUVs and trucks toward more fuel-efficient, environmentally friendly options. For years, Stellantis relied on its best-selling models like the Jeep Grand Cherokee and the Dodge Durango to drive its sales. But as we saw in 2024, even those top sellers started to falter. The Grand Cherokee, once one of the most popular SUVs in America, started losing traction, while the Durango and Charger, once the face of Dodge's performance cars, couldn't maintain momentum in the face of growing competition. Consumers began looking elsewhere, toward electric vehicles, EVs, from companies like Tesla, Ford, and GM, which were pushing ahead in the electrification race. Meanwhile, Stellantis was stuck, trying to maintain its foothold in the traditional vehicle market while playing catch-up in the EV sector. The company was under immense pressure from multiple angles. First, rising material costs were squeezing margins. The tariffs imposed by the US government in late 2024 had further intensified this challenge, especially for Stellantis, which relied heavily on parts imported from Canada, Mexico, and abroad. The sudden 25% tariff on imported vehicles and parts.
He's announced a 25% tariff on all cars imported into the United States from the 2nd of April.
Meant that every vehicle Stellantis produced became exponentially more expensive. But that wasn't the whole story. The greater issue was that Stellantis had become too reliant on its legacy models, unable to pivot quickly enough to respond to the rapidly changing landscape of the automotive industry. Unlike some of its competitors, who had aggressively pursued electric vehicle development, Stellantis was still in the early stages of shifting toward electrification. While GM and Ford had already moved ahead with full EV lineups, Stellantis was bogged down in production schedules for vehicles that no longer reflected the market's needs. And even worse, it hadn't completely addressed the growing global demand for more sustainable options. Meanwhile, the competition wasn't just sitting idle. Foreign automakers, particularly from Asia and Europe, were becoming more competitive, especially in the EV space. Hyundai, Toyota, and Volkswagen were gaining significant market share in the US, offering consumers affordable, high-quality alternatives that were environmentally friendly and fuel-efficient. On the other hand, Chinese automakers were making their move, bolstered by aggressive pricing strategies and a global push to dominate EV production. This created a perfect storm. Stellantis was caught between the need to maintain its traditional production lines while also trying to transition into the electric age. But the company was struggling. The task of balancing legacy production, massive retooling for EVs, and the rising cost of production due to tariffs was overwhelming. The decision to lay off over 3,500 workers was not just a financial move. It was an admission that Stellantis couldn't sustain the business as it had been operating for decades. It was a sign that the company was being forced to adapt to a new reality. But here's the most unsettling part. The layoffs weren't the end. They were just the beginning. Behind the scenes, Stellantis was also looking to realign its entire operational strategy. And the major shift wasn't just about production cuts. It was about a recalibration of the company's identity and the way it approached the market. In 2024, Stellantis had announced its commitment to electrification, but by 2025, that commitment began to waver. The company began shifting focus back to hybrid and internal combustion engine, ICE, vehicles, reversing course on its previous plans to go all in on EVs. The pivot toward hybrids and ICE vehicles wasn't just a strategic decision, it was a response to economic realities. As interest rates rose and EV demand softened, Stellantis realized that the aggressive electrification strategy it had once championed might not be sustainable in the short term. Unlike Tesla, which had streamlined its production process and focused on building a robust EV infrastructure, Stellantis was struggling to get its footing. The company's leadership understood that it couldn't risk alienating its core customer base, who still valued traditional vehicles. And so, in an attempt to balance the old and the new, Stellantis began to double down on its hybrid offerings, extending the life of popular ICE models like the Dodge Charger and Jeep Wrangler. But even this new direction was fraught with uncertainty. What Stellantis was really facing was a fundamental identity crisis. Jeep had built its reputation on rugged, gas-powered SUVs. Dodge had become synonymous with muscle cars, and Chrysler's once luxurious lineup had been left in the dust. As the company shifted focus to electric and hybrid vehicles, it risked losing the very thing that made these brands iconic in the first place, their identity. Jeep wasn't just an SUV, it was a symbol of adventure, of off-road dominance. Would hybridizing the brand really capture the same rugged essence? Could Dodge continue to dominate the performance car market with hybrids, or would it lose its muscle car soul? Chrysler was already struggling with a minimal lineup. Was it too late for a comeback? In the end, Stellantis was stuck between two worlds, one that relied on traditional vehicles and one that demanded innovation and electrification. Each move they made was reactive, not proactive, and it seemed as if the company was stumbling forward, unsure of which path to take. So, what happens when a legacy automaker like Stellantis finds itself stuck in a high-stakes battle between traditional cars and the future of electric vehicles? Is the shift to hybrid and ICE models a temporary setback or a sign that Stellantis has lost its way? The domino effect. What comes next for the US auto industry? The layoffs at Stellantis were not just a corporate decision. They were the opening salvo in a much larger battle playing out within the American auto industry. The ripples from Stellantis' move have already begun to affect suppliers, local economies, and workers across the country. The question now is, what happens next? Will Stellantis' strategy shift signal the death knell for legacy automakers? Or can the company adapt to survive in an increasingly competitive and volatile marketplace? As we saw earlier, Stellantis is making some bold moves. They've slashed production, made strategic pivots toward hybrid and internal combustion engine, ICE vehicles, and even started reopening old plants like Belvidere in Illinois. But the real story here isn't just the layoffs or plant closures, it's the larger shift occurring in the US auto market. Stellantis is, in many ways, a microcosm of the challenges facing the entire industry. And if the company can't find a way to adapt, it's not just Stellantis that will be affected, it's the entire legacy manufacturing sector. One thing is clear, the US auto industry is at a crossroads. The market is shifting rapidly, new players are entering the field, and traditional brands like Jeep, Dodge, and Chrysler are struggling to keep up. Foreign automakers have been pushing aggressively into the US market for years, with companies like Toyota, Hyundai, and Volkswagen outpacing American manufacturers in areas like electric vehicles, EVs, and hybrid technology. While US automakers were busy holding on to legacy products and dealing with outdated models, these foreign competitors were busy positioning themselves for the future. The rising success of EVs and hybrids has already upended the entire auto market. Companies like Tesla have been making huge inroads, and other companies, such as Ford and GM, have also made significant progress in their EV and hybrid offerings. Meanwhile, traditional automakers, especially Stellantis, have been caught playing catch-up, their previous reliance on gas-guzzling models failing to meet changing consumer demand. The shift toward clean energy, fuel efficiency, and sustainability has become a non-negotiable reality, and those who fail to keep up risk being left behind. But it's not just about competition from foreign manufacturers. The pressure is also coming from within the US market itself. The US government, particularly under President Donald Trump, has aggressively pushed for Made in America policies, leading to tariffs on imported vehicles and parts. The 25% tariff imposed in late 2024 was a significant blow to companies like Stellantis, which relied heavily on imported components and international supply chains. Suddenly, the cost of producing vehicles in the US increased dramatically, and for an automaker like Stellantis, which had already been facing rising material costs, this additional financial burden created an urgent need for drastic changes.
In response to 25% tariffs President Trump put into effect on foreign cars and car parts.
What does this mean for workers? The layoffs at Stellantis' Toledo and Warren plants were just the beginning. As automakers like Stellantis scramble to adjust their production strategies, more workers could find themselves in the same precarious position. As companies try to balance between old and new models, there will inevitably be a push to shed jobs in areas that are no longer central to their future plans. This is not just a problem for Stellantis, it's a problem for the entire US auto industry. Thousands of workers depend on these jobs, and when companies shift gears, they risk leaving entire communities in economic ruin. The ripple effect is already being felt. In Toledo, where over 1,100 workers were laid off, local businesses that depended on the plant's workforce have already reported a sharp drop in revenue. Restaurants, retail stores, and service industries that relied on the workers' disposable income are now facing the harsh realities of a shrinking economy. The same is happening in Warren, where the layoff announcement has sent shockwaves through local supply chains and businesses that depend on the plant's operations. The jobs lost at Stellantis may be gone, but the broader economic impact will continue to reverberate throughout these communities for years to come. For many workers, the sense of betrayal is palpable. They had been loyal to the company for decades, working tirelessly on the assembly lines that made Jeep, Dodge, and Chrysler vehicles. But now, after decades of commitment, they find themselves tossed aside like any other expendable asset. Stellantis executives might frame the layoffs as necessary to align with market conditions, but for workers, this move feels like a betrayal, one that is only worsened by the uncertainty of the future. There's no clear plan, no firm timeline for recovery, and no real assurances that things will improve anytime soon. In the face of this, workers are left with a sense of abandonment, with little hope for the future of the industry they've spent their lives serving. Meanwhile, the company's decisions to move away from gas-powered vehicles in favor of hybrids and electric options will have major implications for the rest of the auto sector. Stellantis' shift may have been a response to internal pressures and shifting market demands, but it also signals something larger about the future of US manufacturing. As the US auto market transitions to cleaner energy, other manufacturers will be forced to make similar decisions. Ford and GM have already accelerated their shift to electric and hybrid vehicles, but even they will face challenges. The push for cleaner vehicles, combined with new tariffs and rising production costs, creates an environment where companies will need to pivot quickly or risk being left behind. The only question is, will they be able to adapt in time? For Stellantis, it's not just about re-engineering their vehicle lineup, it's about survival. The shift toward EVs and hybrids is crucial for their future success, but they're facing fierce competition from companies that have already established themselves as leaders in the market. Ford, GM, and Tesla have all pushed aggressively into the electric vehicle space, and while Stellantis has made moves to catch up, it's clear that they're lagging behind. But it's not just a race for technology, it's a race for perception. Stellantis has long been a household name in the US, but its image is beginning to shift. The recent layoffs, combined with the company's slow shift to electric vehicles, could tarnish its reputation in the eyes of consumers and investors alike. No longer just competing on product, Stellantis now faces a challenge of image and innovation. Will the public continue to trust a company that's late to the EV game? Can Stellantis win back consumer loyalty, or will they be overtaken by companies that have positioned themselves as the future of the industry? As Stellantis grapples with these questions, there's one final factor at play: the pressure from Washington. The Biden administration, along with state governments, is already taking a close look at the future of the US auto industry. With Stellantis making dramatic moves, cutting jobs, shifting production, and pivoting toward hybrids, there's growing concern among lawmakers about the economic impact of these decisions. The government is unlikely to offer direct bailouts, but there could be a renewed push for tax incentives, subsidies, and policy changes aimed at stabilizing the auto sector. It's clear that Stellantis, as well as the entire US auto industry, is at a turning point. The shift to electric vehicles, coupled with internal struggles, political pressures, and growing competition, is creating a new landscape for automakers. The decisions Stellantis makes in the coming months will shape the industry for years to come. What's next for Stellantis and the US auto industry? Will they find a way to adapt, or will the pressure from foreign competitors, rising costs, and shifting consumer demands be too much to overcome? Does Stellantis' future hold? As Stellantis pushes forward into an uncertain future, the company's next steps will have profound implications not just for itself, but for the broader US auto industry. The choices it makes now, amid shifting consumer preferences, a volatile economy, and intense competition, will dictate whether it can emerge as a leader in the next-generation vehicle market, or whether it will fade into obscurity, overtaken by more agile competitors. The recent layoffs, plant closures, and strategic realignments are only part of the picture. What Stellantis is really grappling with is the daunting question: can we survive in this new automotive world? For decades, the company, along with other legacy automakers, relied on a tried-and-true business model: produce a wide variety of gas-powered vehicles that could appeal to almost every American driver. But that model is no longer sustainable in a world where clean energy, environmental concerns, and new technology are rapidly reshaping the automotive landscape. In some ways, Stellantis' position mirrors the fate of many traditional manufacturers that have struggled to keep pace with technological advancements. As we saw with Ford and GM, the transition to electric vehicles, EVs, requires a massive overhaul of their entire production process. The scale of investment needed to develop, produce, and deliver EVs is immense. Unlike traditional vehicles, EVs require new manufacturing processes, different supply chains, and entirely new technology platforms. Stellantis' delay in committing to this transition is now being felt in the form of declining sales, dwindling brand loyalty, and layoffs. The shift to EVs isn't just a matter of keeping up with competitors. It's about the very survival of these companies. The auto industry has always been about innovation, and for automakers like Stellantis, who once thrived on their ability to produce reliable trucks, SUVs, and sedans, that innovation must now come in the form of clean energy vehicles. But what happens when the very thing you're trying to innovate, electric cars, becomes a space dominated by new players like Tesla and even tech giants like Apple, who are slowly but surely entering the automotive market, Stellantis isn't the only legacy automaker facing this dilemma. Ford, GM, and others are making significant strides toward electrification. Ford has launched its electric F-150 Lightning.
Ford's now riding the F-150 Lightning in its drive to gain ground.
And the Mustang Mach-E, while GM is doubling down on its electric plans with its Ultium battery platform. But while these companies are making progress, they too are grappling with the same challenges: high production costs, supply chain bottlenecks, and a consumer base that isn't fully sold on the idea of going electric just yet. This is a battle Stellantis can't afford to lose. Its future depends on how well it can transition to electrification while keeping its production lines and profit margins in check. But the obstacles go beyond just the technology. Stellantis also has to contend with increasing pressure from both domestic and international markets. In the US, the government has placed heavy emphasis on reducing carbon emissions, offering incentives for EV purchases, and pushing for stricter emissions regulations. Yet, the US market remains divided. While states like California and New York are aggressively adopting clean energy vehicles, other regions like the Midwest and Southeast are still dominated by gas-powered vehicles, especially large trucks and SUVs. Stellantis's future success will depend on its ability to balance these regional differences and tailor its production to meet local demands, all while keeping an eye on the global stage. International competition adds another layer of complexity. In Europe, where emissions regulations are stricter, Stellantis has invested heavily in electric vehicles, launching several EV models under brands like Peugeot and Fiat. However, the US market remains a major battleground for Stellantis. As foreign automakers like Hyundai, Toyota, and Volkswagen ramp up their EV offerings in the US, Stellantis must find a way to differentiate itself in a crowded and increasingly competitive market. The company has struggled to create a meaningful presence in the electric SUV and truck segments, areas where Tesla and Ford have already gained ground. If Stellantis continues to drag its feet, it risks losing valuable market share to companies that have already staked their claim. For Stellantis, however, it's not just about product innovation, it's also about leadership. The company's recent leadership shakeup, most notably the resignation of CEO Carlos Tavares, signaled deep dissatisfaction with the company's current direction. Tavares, who was hailed as the mastermind behind the merger that formed Stellantis, had been instrumental in the company's early success. But as competition increased and market realities shifted, it became clear that Tavares' strategy was no longer enough to keep Stellantis on top. The sudden resignation raised questions about the stability of Stellantis' leadership and its ability to make the tough decisions required to thrive in this new era. The internal leadership struggles aren't just about personalities, they're about the company's long-term vision. Stellantis needs a leader who can balance innovation with tradition, who can navigate the complexities of electrification while maintaining its legacy as a major player in the global automotive market. The next CEO of Stellantis will face the monumental task of leading the company through the most significant transformation in its history. But this will require more than just visionary thinking. It will require quick action, decisive leadership, and the ability to build trust with both workers and investors. As Stellantis prepares to roll out new models, including hybrid versions of its iconic Jeep Wrangler and Dodge Charger, it's facing the challenge of maintaining its brand identity while embracing the future. Jeep, once synonymous with rugged off-road adventure, is now pivoting toward electrified, tech-savvy vehicles. Dodge, known for its muscle cars, is exploring hybrids. Chrysler, once a proud luxury brand, is scrambling to stay relevant with a limited lineup. The road ahead isn't just about retooling production lines. It's about rethinking what these brands stand for in the eyes of consumers. Can Stellantis balance the nostalgia and loyalty these brands command with the demands of an increasingly eco-conscious market? With Stellantis at a crossroads, the question remains, can they recover from this deepening crisis? As the competition in the EV space intensifies, and with more layoffs, plant closures, and leadership changes on the horizon, Will Stellantis be able to adapt in time, or will they fade into history? The tipping point. As Stellantis moves into 2025, its future is anything but certain. The company's shift toward hybrid and electric vehicles, combined with the layoffs, plant closures, and ongoing leadership struggles, has made one thing clear. The American auto industry is at a critical juncture. The choices Stellantis makes in the next year will determine whether it survives as a major player or fades into irrelevance. The US auto industry is no longer the fortress it once was. Foreign competition is stronger than ever. The push for electric vehicles has reshaped consumer expectations, and the global shift towards sustainability is only accelerating. Stellantis must adapt, or risk being swallowed up by the very forces it has long dominated. But the pressure is mounting. Consumers are no longer satisfied with the same old vehicles, and the demand for clean energy is only growing. In a market where electric vehicles are becoming the new standard, Stellantis' reliance on aging models and slow-to-develop EV offerings is a liability. The company's internal struggles, combined with the growing competition from both domestic and foreign automakers, could mean that Stellantis has already missed its chance to lead the charge. As the UAW prepares for another round of contract negotiations, the pressure from workers and unions will only increase. They've seen firsthand the costs of Stellantis' decision-making, and they won't stand for another round of job cuts or empty promises. The company's relationship with its workforce is fractured, and rebuilding trust will be no easy feat. Stellantis, like the US auto industry itself, must now decide if it's ready to evolve and embrace the future. With EVs, hybrids, and new technologies reshaping the market, there is hope that Stellantis can recalibrate and rise to the occasion.
Battery electric concept vehicle, a stunning vision of Ram's future.
But in an industry where speed, adaptability, and vision are everything, the question remains, can Stellantis turn things around in time? The stakes couldn't be higher for Stellantis and the entire US auto industry. As the company fights for its survival, the future of iconic brands like Jeep, Dodge, and Chrysler hangs in the balance. The decisions made now will define the next chapter of American manufacturing. Will Stellantis emerge as a leader in the EV revolution, or will it fade into history? We'll keep you updated on every twist and turn, so make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more insider updates. This is only the beginning of a story that will shape the future of the US auto industry for years to come.